The Crusades, spanning roughly from 1096 to 1291, were a series of religiously sanctioned military campaigns waged primarily by Western European Christians. Their stated goal was to reclaim the Holy Land, particularly Jerusalem, from Muslim control, yet the reality of these campaigns was far more complex and often far more brutal than the lofty rhetoric suggested. Beyond the military objectives, the Crusades were entangled with political ambitions, economic interests, and deep-seated religious rivalries that often erupted into violence against communities caught in the crossfire. Among the lesser-known victims of the Crusades were the Orthodox Christian communities, particularly the monastic women who had devoted their lives to spiritual contemplation and service. To understand the plight of Orthodox nuns during this period, it is essential first to grasp the religious and political tensions that framed the era. By the late 11th century, the Christian world was sharply divided. The Great Schism of 1054 had formally split Christianity into two distinct branches: the Roman Catholic Church in the West, under the authority of the Pope, and the Eastern Orthodox Church, led by the Patriarch of Constantinople. This division was not merely theological, it was also cultural, linguistic, and political. Latin-speaking Western Europeans often viewed the Greek-speaking Eastern Christians with suspicion, labeling them as schismatics, while Eastern Christians considered the Latin Church aggressive, domineering, and morally corrupt. The call to arms by Pope Urban II in 1095 at the Council of Clermont sought to unite Western Christendom under a common religious cause to liberate Jerusalem and other sacred sites from Muslim rule. While this appeal resonated with knights and nobles eager for adventure, wealth, or spiritual merit, it also came with an implicit assumption that all Christians not under papal authority were potential targets for subjugation. Orthodox Christians, despite sharing the same basic faith, were often seen as outsiders and, in some instances, as obstacles to papal supremacy. This tension set the stage for a tragic collision of piety and violence that would devastate monastic communities. Monasteries and convents were central to the religious, educational, and social fabric of medieval Eastern Christendom. Orthodox nuns devoted themselves to prayer, scholarship, and charitable works, often caring for the poor, sick, and orphaned. Many convents were repositories of valuable manuscripts, relics, and artistic treasures. They functioned as spiritual sanctuaries, but also as centers of cultural preservation, where the written word, religious art were safeguarded for future generations. The nuns' lives were rigorously disciplined, focused on obedience, humility, and devotion. In many ways, their spiritual vocation positioned them as guardians not only of faith, but also of knowledge and tradition. However, monasteries were not always shielded by their sanctity. In the volatile climate of the Crusades, religious ideals often conflicted with military expedience. Crusader armies were poorly disciplined and motivated by a mix of religious fervor, personal ambition, and material gain. The promise of indulgences, the remission of sins for those who fought, fueled a zealous and often ruthless mindset. This context helps explain why Orthodox convents, despite their spiritual purpose, became targets for Crusader aggression. Their wealth, seclusion, and perceived defiance of papal authority made them vulnerable to plunder, intimidation, and violence. The Crusader perception of Orthodox Christians was further complicated by propaganda and misunderstandings. Western chroniclers sometimes portrayed Eastern Christians as heretical or morally lax, exaggerating differences to justify aggression. These narratives created an environment in which extreme acts, including the violation of sacred spaces, were rationalized as part of a divine mission. In many accounts, Crusader leaders argued that forceful submission of Orthodox communities was necessary to achieve religious unity under the Latin Church, a justification that tragically overlooked the humanity and dignity of the individuals affected, particularly women who had devoted their lives to spiritual service. Geopolitically, the Crusader states, such as the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, and the County of Tripoli, relied on the control of cities, trade routes, and strategic fortresses. Monasteries, often located in or near these key sites, were inadvertently drawn into the conflict. Some were plundered for resources, while others were forcibly converted or repurposed for military uses. The nuns, committed to a life of seclusion and prayer, found themselves unprepared for the sudden intrusion of heavily armed soldiers. The clash between the nuns' spiritual devotion and the Crusaders' militant zeal set the stage for some of the most harrowing abuses of the period. It is also important to note that while the primary narrative of the Crusades focuses on battles between Christians and Muslims, internal Christian conflicts were equally destructive. Orthodox communities in regions like Antioch, Constantinople, and other parts of the Levant faced not only external threats but also persecution from Western Christians who sought to assert dominance. This intra-Christian violence often blurred moral boundaries, with monasteries and convents suffering in ways similar to those inflicted by foreign enemies. The context of the Crusades reveals a world in which ideology, ambition, and prejudice intertwined with tragic consequences. For Orthodox nuns, their faith, discipline, and commitment to spiritual ideals made them both revered and vulnerable. They were not warriors, yet they bore the brunt of a war that was ostensibly about reclaiming holy sites. Their sanctuaries, intended as refuges from worldly chaos, were transformed into zones of fear and violence. The juxtaposition of the nuns' devotion against the Crusaders' aggression illustrates a broader pattern of medieval warfare. Spiritual ideals often collided brutally with human ambition and prejudice. By situating the experiences of Orthodox nuns within this broader context, we gain a deeper understanding of the complexity and tragedy of the Crusades. These were not merely conflicts over territory or theology. They were violent confrontations that exposed the fragility of human morality when power, religion, and ideology collide. The nuns' suffering, often overlooked in traditional histories of the Crusades, provides a stark reminder of the human cost of religious wars and the vulnerability of those whose lives are devoted to service and faith. In conclusion, the context of the Crusades was shaped by a mix of religious fervor, political ambition, cultural misunderstanding, and social hierarchy. Within this volatile environment, Orthodox nuns were not merely bystanders. They were targets, witnesses, and victims of a wider struggle that pitted brother against brother, Latin against Greek, and zeal against devotion. Their plight reminds us that history is rarely clean or heroic. It is often messy, tragic, and marked by the suffering of the innocent, caught in forces far beyond their control. Understanding this context is crucial before delving into the specific atrocities and personal stories that would define the experiences of Orthodox nuns during these turbulent centuries before the tumultuous waves of the Crusades swept through Eastern Christendom. Orthodox monastic life represented a world of spiritual devotion, intellectual pursuit, and disciplined community living. For centuries, monasteries and convents had been sanctuaries of faith, places where men and women dedicated themselves wholly to God, seeking both personal holiness and the preservation of religious and cultural traditions. Among these, the life of Orthodox nuns was particularly structured, imbued with a combination of rigorous discipline, contemplative prayer, and communal responsibilities. Understanding this life illuminates not only the sanctity of these spaces, but also the shockingly vulnerable position nuns were thrust into when Crusader armies arrived on their doorstep. Monastic life in the Orthodox tradition was shaped by centuries of spiritual practice, drawing upon the teachings of early church fathers and the ascetic movements of the Egyptian desert. Women who chose to enter a convent made a profound commitment. They renounced worldly attachments, including family ties, property, and the prospects of marriage or children. Their days were governed by prayer, fasting, and service. Unlike many Western convents that had begun to emphasize education for noble daughters, Orthodox convents were deeply focused on spiritual formation, cultivating inner discipline and humility as pathways to divine communion. Daily life was structured around the divine office, a series of prayers recited at regular intervals, from dawn to night. Nuns would gather multiple times a day to chant psalms, recite prayers, and reflect on scripture. Silence was a central component of monastic discipline, providing a contemplative environment conducive to prayer and meditation. Work was considered a form of spiritual exercise. Nuns engaged in tasks such as gardening, weaving, manuscript copying, and preparing food. These activities were not merely utilitarian. They were imbued with the understanding that labor itself could be an offering to God, a way to sanctify the mundane and cultivate virtue. Education within these convents was surprisingly advanced for the period. Many nuns were literate in Greek, capable of reading and transcribing sacred texts, including the Gospels, Psalters, and theological treatises. Manuscript copying was both a spiritual discipline and a cultural mission, preserving knowledge in a time before printing presses. Convents often maintained libraries of religious and philosophical texts, illuminated manuscripts, and relics of saints, making them centers of learning as well as sanctuaries of faith. These intellectual pursuits were intertwined with devotional practice, reflecting the Orthodox belief that the cultivation of the mind and soul were inseparable in the quest for holiness. Beyond their spiritual and intellectual pursuits, nuns were also deeply embedded in the social life of their communities. Convents often functioned as centers of charity, providing aid to the poor, care for the sick, and refuge for travelers. In many towns and villages, nuns were known for their generosity and healing abilities, relying on herbal knowledge, basic medical care, and spiritual guidance. Their role extended to counseling, education, and even conflict mediation within the surrounding community. In short, convents were not isolated hermitages, but vital institutions contributing to the oral, social, and cultural fabric of their regions. Architecturally, Orthodox convents were designed to foster both contemplation and community. Typically, they were enclosed by high walls, creating a clear boundary between the sacred space within and the secular world outside. Within these walls, the buildings were arranged to support communal worship, shared meals, and individual reflection. Chapels, refectories, dormitories, and workspaces were carefully planned to balance solitude with the needs of communal living. Gardens and courtyards provided spaces for prayerful walking, tending crops, and quiet meditation. The environment itself reflected the monastic values of order, harmony, and spiritual focus. The spiritual life of nuns was deeply connected to the broader Orthodox Church, though they often exercised a degree of independence in their internal governance. Abbesses or prioresses led the communities, overseeing both spiritual formation and practical administration. Decisions were made collectively, with an emphasis on humility, obedience, and discernment. The nuns' vows were lifelong commitments, and leaving the convent was rare and often only permitted under extraordinary circumstances. This structure created a close-knit, disciplined community where each member supported the others in the pursuit of a shared spiritual ideal. Orthodox nuns also engaged with the wider religious world through pilgrimage and the veneration of relics. Pilgrimages to holy sites, such as Mount Athos or Jerusalem, were undertaken to deepen spiritual insight, offer prayers, and seek divine guidance. Monasteries frequently housed relics of saints or sacred icons, which were revered as conduits of spiritual power and protection. These sacred objects were not only religious symbols, but also markers of cultural identity, linking local communities to the broader Orthodox tradition. Protecting these relics and icons was considered a sacred duty, one that would later place convents at the center of Crusader aggression. Despite the rigor of monastic life, there was also a profound sense of joy, community, and purpose. Music, hymnody, and ritual ceremonies punctuated daily routines, offering moments of aesthetic and spiritual beauty. Feasts and liturgical celebrations connected the nuns to the liturgical calendar, reinforcing a sense of continuity with centuries of Christian practice. This rhythm of devotion, work, and contemplation created a life that, while austere, was rich in meaning, discipline, and spiritual depth. Yet this very sanctity and separation from the secular world made Orthodox convents both revered and vulnerable. Their wealth in manuscripts, icons, and relics, combined with their perceived moral authority, attracted the attention of outsiders. When the Crusaders arrived, these convents, symbols of devotion and cultural preservation, became targets precisely because of their spiritual and material significance. The nuns' isolated and disciplined life, designed to protect them from worldly distractions, offered little defense against the sudden intrusion of armed, zealous soldiers. Their dedication to prayer and service, which had defined their existence, could not shield them from the horrors that awaited. In summary, Orthodox monastic life before the Crusades was a world of spiritual rigor, intellectual cultivation, and communal service. Nuns lived lives dedicated to prayer, study, and care for their communities, preserving cultural and religious treasures while embodying the highest ideals of Orthodox Christianity. Their convents were sanctuaries of devotion, learning, and charity, places where the soul and mind could flourish. Yet the very virtues that defined their lives, piety, dedication, and seclusion, would become sources of vulnerability when the tide of Crusader violence swept through eastern lands. Understanding the richness and sanctity of this pre-Crusader monastic life highlights the magnitude of what was lost and the tragedy of the assaults that followed. The arrival of the Crusaders in Orthodox lands marked a turning point, not only in the history of the Crusades, but also in the lives of countless monastic women who had until then devoted themselves entirely to spiritual pursuits. For Orthodox nuns, the invasion brought terror, destruction, and unimaginable violation of spaces once considered sacred. The Crusader armies, driven by religious zeal, ambition, and the promise of wealth, often treated the women and their convents with a brutality that history has scarcely recorded in full detail. Understanding the mechanisms of this invasion and occupation sheds light on one of the darkest chapters of medieval warfare, where sanctity was desecrated and piety became a target. The initial approach of the Crusaders was typically strategic and calculated. Monasteries were not merely religious centers, they were repositories of wealth, culture, and influence. Many convents held valuable manuscripts, icons, relics, and other treasures accumulated over centuries. These were often coveted as spoils of war, and the Crusaders viewed their seizure as both a practical gain and a divine right. The armies advanced with military precision, surrounding convents, cutting off access to outside support, and intimidating the inhabitants with the presence of armed men who answered only to their commanders' orders. Upon entering these sacred spaces, the Crusaders frequently disregarded the religious sanctity that the nuns sought to preserve. Contemporary accounts, chronicled by both Latin and Greek observers, describe scenes of looting, desecration, and violence. Churches and chapels were ransacked, icons were stolen or destroyed, and sacred relics were taken as trophies or sold for profit. The very symbols of Orthodox devotion, crosses, altars, and manuscript collections, were treated as objects of temporal value rather than instruments of spiritual significance. For the nuns, witnessing the violation of these sacred objects was not merely a material loss, but a profound spiritual trauma. Physical violence against nuns was tragically common. The Crusaders, emboldened by a mix of religious fervor and the chaotic lawlessness of war, often subjected women to beatings, abductions, and sexual assault. The vulnerability of nuns, confined within convent walls and committed to a life of seclusion, made them easy targets. There are records, though scarce, of entire convents being stormed, with nuns taken captive or executed for resisting demands. The invasion transformed spaces of prayer into sites of fear and terror, shattering the very notion of sanctuary that monasteries had long represented. In some cases, nuns were forcibly converted or coerced into attending Latin rites under the oversight of Crusader clergy. This imposition was part of a broader effort to assert the dominance of the Latin Church over Orthodox territories, reflecting both religious intolerance and political ambition. Abbesses and senior nuns who had once guided their communities with authority were stripped of influence, replaced by Crusader-appointed overseers, or compelled to swear allegiance to foreign religious leaders. Such acts were not only violations of personal freedom, but also attacks on the institutional integrity and spiritual mission of the convents. The psychological impact on the nuns was profound. Women who had dedicated their lives to prayer, contemplation, and communal service found themselves confronting the terrifying presence of armed strangers. The discipline and spiritual focus had governed their lives offered no protection against the sudden intrusion of violence. Many were forced into impossible choices: submission to Crusader demands, flight into the surrounding countryside, or resistance with the risk of death. Chroniclers report that some nuns attempted to hide in secret chambers, disguise themselves as laywomen, or flee under cover of night. Yet for many, escape was impossible, and the presence of the Crusaders meant living under constant threat. Beyond the immediate violence, the occupation had long-term implications for convent life. Crusader forces often repurposed monastic buildings for military or administrative use. Dormitories became barracks, chapels were converted into storage spaces, and gardens, once carefully tended by the nuns, were trampled or destroyed. The disruption of daily routines eroded communal discipline and spiritual practice, leaving nuns unable to maintain the rhythm of prayer, work, and contemplation that had defined their lives. In essence, the invasion did not merely threaten life and property, it struck at the very core of monastic identity. Resistance, though courageous, was perilous. There are accounts of nuns barricading themselves within convent walls, refusing to surrender relics, manuscripts, or sacred spaces. In some instances, Crusader forces responded with extreme measures, including the burning of buildings, execution of defiant women, or mass abductions. These acts highlight the stark power imbalance. Nuns, trained for spiritual struggle rather than combat, faced adversaries for whom violence was a sanctioned tool of conquest. Yet despite the terror, stories of resistance also reflect the resilience and courage of these women, who sought to protect both their lives and their spiritual heritage against overwhelming odds. The occupation also had broader consequences for the surrounding commune. Orthodox laity who relied on convents for education, charity, and religious guidance were suddenly deprived of these services. Convents had long served as hubs of cultural preservation, hosting libraries, schools, and centers for manuscript copying. With the arrival of Crusaders, much of this intellectual and spiritual infrastructure was destroyed or displaced. The loss extended beyond the nuns themselves, impacting the entire Orthodox population and eroding the continuity of religious and cultural life in the region. It is important to recognize that the Crusaders' actions were not uniform. Some leaders attempted to maintain alliances with Orthodox communities, protect monasteries, or show restraint. However, such exceptions were rare, and the prevailing pattern was one of domination, plunder, and suppression. The chaos of war, coupled with deep-seated prejudice against Orthodox Christians, created conditions in which convents were repeatedly violated and nuns were systematically victimized. The invasion thus represents not merely a military campaign, but a targeted assault on a community whose power lay in spiritual devotion rather than martial strength. In conclusion, the invasion and occupation of Orthodox convents by Crusader forces were marked by a confluence of violence, intimidation, and cultural desecration. Nuns who had devoted their lives to God found themselves confronting soldiers motivated by religious zeal, greed, and political ambition. Sacred spaces were transformed into arenas of terror, and daily monastic life, prayer, work, and communal harmony was violently disrupted. Physical and psychological abuse, forced conversions, and the plunder of treasures left enduring scars on both the women and the communities they served. Understanding the depth of this devastation is crucial to appreciating the courage and resilience of Orthodox nuns, whose steadfast commitment to faith persisted even in the face of unimaginable adversity. By examining these events, we gain insight not only into the horrors inflicted by the Crusaders, but also into the broader patterns of medieval warfare, religious intolerance, and the vulnerability of those devoted to spiritual life. The invasion and occupation were more than isolated acts of violence. They were systematic assaults on a way of life that valued contemplation, service, and devotion above all else. In the shadows of these tragedies, the nuns' endurance stands as a testament to faith under fire, offering a sobering reminder of the human cost of religious conflict amid the chaos and destruction wrought by the Crusaders. Orthodox nuns were not merely passive victims. Many displayed extraordinary courage and resilience in the face of overwhelming violence. Their stories of resistance and tragedy offer both heart-wrenching and inspiring glimpses into lives that were abruptly transformed from quiet devotion to survival against unimaginable odds. These accounts illuminate the human dimension of the Crusades, showing how faith, conviction, and communal solidarity could coexist with profound suffering and loss. One of the most remarkable forms of resistance was spiritual defiance. Even when armed forces stormed their convents, many nuns refused to renounce their faith or participate in Latin rites. They continued to pray in secret, hide sacred relics, and perform rituals under the cover of night. The abbess or prioress often led by example, demonstrating unwavering commitment to orthodox practices despite the threat of punishment. This spiritual courage was not merely symbolic. It represented a conscious effort to protect the integrity of their religious identity against external forces that sought to suppress it. Chroniclers from both Eastern and Western sources record instances of nuns hiding icons, sacred texts, and holy relics in hidden chambers, walls, or underground vaults. These acts of preservation were often undertaken at great personal risk. Discovery could mean imprisonment, torture, or execution. Physical resistance, while rarer due to the nuns' lack of military training, also occurred. In some monasteries, nuns barricaded doors, used improvised weapons, or refused to open gates to invading forces. Historical accounts describe desperate attempts to delay the Crusaders long enough to evacuate valuable manuscripts or to allow younger members of the convent to flee into the surrounding countryside. These acts were often met with brutal retaliation, as the Crusaders sought to enforce compliance through intimidation, violence, or destruction. Yet even in the face of such threats, many nuns chose to protect their communities and sacred objects, prioritizing the spiritual and cultural legacy of their convents over their own personal safety. One particularly harrowing story comes from the region around Antioch, where Crusader forces occupied several Orthodox convents during the late 11th century. According to local chronicles, the abbess of a small convent concealed a collection of precious relics in a hidden crypt beneath the chapel. When the Crusaders demanded that she surrender them, she refused, declaring that they belonged to God, not to human hands. In retaliation, the soldiers set fire to the convent, forcing the nuns to flee into nearby forests. Some survived, but many perished in the flames, their lives claimed by both human violence and the harsh conditions of the wilderness. The story illustrates the high stakes of resistance. Devotion to faith and sacred objects could lead to heroic survival or tragic death, depending on fortune and circumstance. The tragedy was compounded by the particular vulnerability of young and elderly. Nuns, younger women, often physically weaker or less experienced in managing crises, were sometimes captured and subjected to abuse or forced labor. Elderly nuns, who had spent decades in prayer and service, faced the cruel indignity of displacement, witnessing the desecration of the spaces they had devoted their lives to maintaining. Entire communities could be shattered within days or weeks. leaving survivors to rebuild amid trauma and loss. Chroniclers note that the psychological scars of these experiences endured long after the immediate violence had ended, influencing the communal memory and religious practices of the affected regions for generations. Despite the pervasive danger, instances of resilience and heroism were frequent. Some convents managed to organize escapes for vulnerable members, smuggling nuns and sacred objects to safer regions under cover of night. In other cases, nuns coordinated with sympathetic locals who provided shelter, food, and guidance through the surrounding countryside. These acts of solidarity highlight the broader networks of support that existed within Orthodox communities and underscore the courage required to maintain faith and humanity amid violent occupation. Yet even stories of resistance are inseparable from stories of tragedy. The human cost was immense, and the scale of suffering often overwhelming. Entire convents could be destroyed in a single raid, with survivors forced into exile or servitude. Historical accounts describe women being sold into slavery, separated from their communities, or coerced into marriages arranged by the conquerors. Such acts violated not only the physical autonomy of the nuns, but also the very principles of monastic life, erasing years of spiritual training, discipline, and communal cohesion. The loss of life, culture, and sacred objects left an indelible mark on Orthodox communities, disrupting religious continuity and creating deep psychological and cultural trauma. The personal toll of these tragedies is exemplified by accounts of nuns who became reluctant symbols of endurance. In some regions, stories emerged of nuns who survived multiple raids, continuing their spiritual practices in secret despite displacement or the destruction of their convents. These women often assumed leadership roles in scattered communities, helping to re-establish monastic practices and maintain the continuity of religious instruction. Their resilience became a testament to the enduring power of faith and devotion, even when institutional structures had been dismantled. Tragedy also extended beyond immediate victims to the cultural and spiritual heritage of the Orthodox Church. Many manuscripts, icons, and relics, treasures painstakingly preserved for generations, were lost or destroyed. Some were transported to Western Europe as spoils, while others were defaced or burned. The intellectual and artistic contributions of Orthodox nuns, which had often been preserved in convent libraries, suffered irreparable damage. This loss represents not only a material deprivation, but also the disruption of centuries of cultural transmission, a silencing of voices that had sustained spiritual and intellectual life within the Eastern Christian world. In reflecting on these stories, it becomes clear that the resistance and tragedy experienced by Orthodox nuns during the Crusades were inextricably linked. Acts of defiance were simultaneously heroic and perilous, often resulting in profound loss. Yet even in tragedy, these stories convey resilience and moral courage, illustrating that the nuns' devotion was not diminished by violence or occupation. Their efforts to preserve sacred objects, maintain spiritual practices, and protect vulnerable members of their communities demonstrate a remarkable commitment to faith under circumstances that tested the very limits of human endurance. Ultimately, these narratives of resistance and tragedy serve as a powerful reminder of the human dimension of historical conflict. They show that behind every military campaign there are lives profoundly affected, sometimes destroyed, sometimes resilient, and often both simultaneously. Orthodox nuns, who had chosen lives of contemplation and devotion, were thrust into a violent confrontation they had neither sought nor desired. Their stories highlight the fragility of sanctity in the face of human aggression and underscore the profound courage required to maintain moral and spiritual integrity amid chaos. In conclusion, the stories of resistance and tragedy among Orthodox nuns during the Crusades reveal a complex tapestry of courage, suffering, and spiritual commitment. From clandestine preservation of sacred relics to desperate physical resistance, these women displayed extraordinary fortitude. Yet alongside these acts of bravery were profound losses of life, culture, and spiritual continuity that reverberated through Orthodox communities for generations. By examining these personal accounts, we gain not only historical insight, but also a deep appreciation for the resilience of the human spirit, even in the most harrowing circumstances. The nuns' experiences stand as a testament to both the horrors of the Crusades and the enduring power of faith in the face of violence. Devastation wrought by the Crusaders on Orthodox nuns and their convents did not end with the immediate acts of violence and plunder. The long-term consequences of these attacks reverberated across Eastern Christendom, affecting not only the surviving nuns, but also the broader religious, cultural, and social fabric of Orthodox communities. The invasions left scars that would endure for generations, altering religious practices, eroding trust between Eastern and Western Christians, and contributing to a legacy of cultural loss that historians are still striving to fully understand. One of the most immediate and tangible consequences was the destruction of infrastructure and disruption of monastic life. Convents that had survived centuries of local political instability were often reduced to rubble by Crusader occupation. Dormitories, chapels, refectories, and gardens, the very spaces that had structured monastic life, were destroyed, looted, or repurposed for military use. Many convents never recovered. Survivors were forced to relocate or merge with other monastic communities, fragmenting long-established networks of spiritual and social cohesion. The loss of physical spaces also meant the loss of the intangible qualities that defined monastic life. The rhythm of prayer, the communal rituals, and the intimate spiritual mentorship that older nuns provided to novices. The psychological and emotional consequences for the nuns themselves were profound. Women who had dedicated their entire lives to spiritual contemplation were traumatized by violence, displacement, and the violation of sacred spaces. Survivors often experienced enduring fear, anxiety, and grief, and these emotions influenced the way they conducted religious life thereafter. Some convents adopted more secretive practices, hiding relics and manuscripts, fortifying structures, or imposing stricter rules on who could enter the monastic community. The trauma of Crusader invasions thus shaped the very character of Orthodox monasticism, instilling a sense of vigilance and caution that persisted for decades. Cultural and intellectual consequences were equally severe. Convents were not merely religious centers, they were hubs of learning, manuscript preservation, and artistic production. Many nuns had been highly educated, skilled in Greek literacy, theology, music, and manuscript illumination. The destruction of libraries and workshops meant the irreparable loss of centuries of accumulated knowledge. Manuscripts copied and preserved by nuns, ranging from sacred texts to historical records, were either destroyed or carried off as spoils of war. Icons and relics, some centuries old, were stolen, defaced, or melted down. The loss of these cultural artifacts impoverished Orthodox heritage, interrupting the transmission of spiritual, intellectual, and artistic traditions that had been nurtured in convents for generations. The religious consequences extended beyond the convent walls. The Crusader attacks deepened the schism between Eastern Orthodox and Western Catholic Christianity. While theological differences had existed since the Great Schism of 1054, the violence against nuns and the desecration of sacred spaces intensified mistrust, resentment, and hostility. Orthodox communities increasingly perceived the Latin Church not as a fellow Christian institution, but as a foreign, aggressive, and predatory force. This perception had lasting effects on interchurch relations, making reconciliation difficult for centuries. Even after the end of the Crusades, the memory of the atrocities against nuns continued to influence ecclesiastical diplomacy, theological polemics, and the collective consciousness of Orthodox Christians. Social consequences were also profound. Convents had served as centers of charity, education, and healthcare for surrounding communities. Nuns tended to the sick, educated children, and provided shelter for travelers and refugees. The destruction of convents disrupted these essential services, leaving communities vulnerable and destabilized. Orphans, widows, and the poor, groups particularly reliant on monastic charity, found themselves without support. In some cases, entire towns experienced long-term economic and social decline because of the loss of the convents that had been central to local life. The occupation and plunder also created demographic consequences. Some nuns were killed during attacks, others captured or sold into slavery, and many more displaced. This sudden reduction in monastic populations meant that the training of novices and the continuation of spiritual leadership were severely hampered. The communal structure of convents, carefully maintained over decades or centuries, was disrupted. New generations of nuns entered convents that had been traumatized by occupation, inheriting both the spiritual traditions and the memory of violence. This intergenerational trauma shaped Orthodox monastic culture, fostering resilience but also a heightened awareness of vulnerability. Politically, the Crusader invasions left Eastern Orthodox communities more isolated and militarily vulnerable. The destruction of convents often coincided with broader territorial losses, weakening local governance structures and leaving regions exposed to further invasions or internal strife. The loss of monasteries, which had often acted as stabilizing centers, meant that both spiritual and secular leadership were disrupted. In some regions, surviving monastic leaders became mediators between local populations and foreign powers, but their ability to influence broader political affairs was diminished, leaving communities more dependent on external protection or local secular rulers. The long-term consequences also manifested in the liturgical and devotional life of the Orthodox Church. In response to the trauma and desecration, nuns and priests sometimes adapted practices to safeguard spiritual treasures and maintain continuity. Hidden chapels, secretive worship, and reinforced sanctuaries became more common. Festivals, processions, and public displays of relics were curtailed or conducted with caution. Even as these adaptations preserved faith practices, they reflect a world forever altered by violence, where the freedom and openness of pre-Crusader religious life could no longer be taken for granted. Despite these devastating impacts, the long-term consequences were not solely negative. The resilience of Orthodox nuns and their communities ensured that monastic traditions survived, even if transformed. Survivors rebuilt convents, preserved what manuscripts and relics they could, and trained new generations of nuns in both spiritual and practical skills. Stories of resistance and survival became part of collective memory, inspiring future communities and contributing to a sense of continuity, identity, and shared history. In this way, the tragedies of the Crusades forged a legacy of resilience, demonstrating that faith and devotion could endure even under extreme adversity. Finally, the legacy of these events extends to modern historical understanding. The experiences of Orthodox nuns challenge traditional narratives of the Crusades that often emphasize military conquest, male heroism, or geopolitical strategy. By highlighting the human cost, particularly the suffering of women dedicated to spiritual life, historians gain a more nuanced understanding of the social and cultural consequences of religious warfare. These long-term effects remind us that historical events are not only about battles and treaties, they are about the lives disrupted, the communities transformed, and the cultural and spiritual legacies reshaped by violence and survival. In conclusion, the long-term consequences of the Crusader invasions on Orthodox nuns were multifaceted and profound. They encompassed the destruction of monastic infrastructure, psychological trauma, loss of cultural heritage, religious schisms, social destabilization, demographic shifts, and political vulnerability. Yet within these consequences lay the seeds of resilience, the rebuilding of convents, the preservation of traditions, and the endurance of faith. Understanding these outcomes provides a critical perspective on the human, cultural, and spiritual costs of the Crusades. The nuns' experiences offer a poignant reminder of the enduring impact of violence on communities, the fragility of sacred institutions in times of war, and the extraordinary courage required to preserve faith, identity, and tradition in the face of unimaginable adversity.